they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely. For my sake, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So, hopefully you're still having the making opportunity to be able to read through the whole Sermon on the Mount. I've been enjoying it. Again, sometimes I'm reading through. Sometimes I like putting it on the audio Bible and listening through. Sometimes audio Bible and following as it goes through. And I think by the time we get done, we'll be very familiar with the Sermon on the Mount. That's just, it's like whatever you're thinking, during the day. Whatever's on your mind. Certainly the Sermon on the Mount is a good thing to have on your mind. You catch that song that just gets stuck in your head and you keep singing or thinking about something somebody told you. Well, if we can keep the Sermon on the Mount in our minds for each day, we're certainly going to be in a good position to face it each and every day in all the trials and whatever comes our way. We'll be able to handle it correctly. I think if we're thinking about this sermon from Jesus. Certainly as we get into the Beatitudes here, the blessed are the pure in heart, so go ahead and look at some of the words here. Again, you can read for yourself what pure means. I try to put up, Connie said, why are you putting all that stuff? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe it's not that important. Sometimes it's very simple, the word is pure, pretty easy word for us to understand, but it shows you sometimes where it's used, and sometimes you get a clearer meaning, sometimes it's just a straight meaning of the word, and then sometimes we need to look at how that word is used scripturally. Certainly here we're looking at that blameless, innocent, unstained with the guilt of anything. I like that.
The previous one you had, I think also speaks very clearly with the idea of being not mixed, not soiled by anything. And where James talks about in James chapter 1, people who are double-minded, or later on in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, trying to serve two masters, of both loving this world and loving God, both seeking after riches and seeking after righteousness. And Jesus begins with the idea of purity, the idea of unmixed, unadulterated heart, that our heart is fully given over to God.
That's right. Instantly, I think of purity, you think of water and water filtration systems now, they advertise 99.9999% pure. Well, that's the water we want to drink, right? We don't want all the contamination and things that shouldn't be in there. So that's one thing that immediately I kind of thought of. And then also forging, you forge something if it's gold or something, you burn it and it goes to a molten state and everything is burning off of it, and then when that cools, it's pure what you have left over. And certainly we're supposed to be that pure, that clean, that 99.999. We'd like to be 100%, right? That's what we're striving for, that pure in heart. And then for heart, obviously we're looking at the thoughts, and the actual meaning says thoughts and feelings, but really I think during Jesus' time, doesn't really hit the feelings as much as it's more we always talk about the heart, or the soul and the mind being together. We use it a little bit differently than they used it. They use it more, wasn't it about emotions? Like sometimes we say, well, my mind's telling me one thing, but my heart's leading me in another direction. That really wasn't what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about your complete being, your will, your desire, your mind, all of that wrapped up. We're supposed to be pure in heart, pure with our entire being, right? It's not just, logically I want to do this, but my heart or my feelings, and that's where we see sometimes people get astray because, my feeling says, I think we should do it this way. But when we're talking about the heart, as Jesus is using it here, it's that pure in heart, our will, our desire, our mind, really the sum of the inner person. If you literally went to, it's just everything, right? How are we supposed to love the Lord, our God, with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, with all of our strength? You know, it's that sum of the whole person. So to try to just put it all together here as we're looking at it, you know, what does that mean then? You put just everything together. Purity of mind, purity of will, purity of desire. You can look at James chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. James chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. And this was a passage that Chad was just referencing, that double-minded. We're not supposed to be double-minded. Our entire being should be going in one direction, in this case, being pure. Let's look at Matthew 15. John, do you want to read that? Matthew 15, 18 and 19. So here, I just put that, you know, the evil comes out of the heart that's not focused on God. Our focus, our entire being should be focused on God. When it's not, that's when we certainly go astray. Matthew 15, verses 18 and 19.
But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and blasphemy.
Okay, and of course this is talking about the things that defile us. So without a focus, without our heart being focused on God, it just naturally, if we were just left to our own devices, without God in our lives, without our Savior, some of these things just naturally proceed out, and that's not what we're supposed to be striving for. We're supposed to be striving for that pure heart. John?
I'm going to answer one of your questions, Lee, because it's a good point to do so. But in some of the things that you listed, the meaning of purity, which were all accurate, the original thought of the word that was used there in Greek was for clarity, and it was for honesty. And your question, part B, the two possible ideas, sincerity of purpose. It portrayed the thought of having purity that was not divided in allegiance. It's purity to God, not divided amongst worldly things and spiritual things. It's purity, period, towards God, was the thought that was with that word. I thought that was great for some of the things that you were saying earlier. It's not a divided man, as Chad referenced in James.
Yeah.
It's an allegiance.
Not serving two different masters. Right. That's right. When you heat something up, if you had some gold mixed with a whole bunch of other stuff, when you heat it up, you don't end up with two different chunks of stuff. You end up with one pure piece of gold. Well, since you're on that, question number 7 there, C. What did Jesus say was the source of evil thoughts, murders, etc.? The heart, right? That's where those things come from. So then the next question, how do we keep the heart pure according to Philippians 4:8? Many of you know that passage, right? Philippians 4 and verse 8. Philippians 4 and verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are noble, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, what are we supposed to do? Meditate on these things, right? So if that's what we're filling our heart with, if that's what we're putting in, what comes out of the heart is going to be exactly what we put in. When we put in these evil thoughts, evil desires, and Jesus is going to get into this the application of these things later, right? When he gets further into the sermon, what is it? Oh, well, you can lust after somebody, right? Just don't commit adultery. No, that's not what Jesus said. That's where it starts. You know, thinking about these things, putting these things into our heart, the end result is what's going to come out the other end is certainly going to be evil and wrong. But if what we're putting in on the front end, if all we're doing is meditating on these good things, then naturally, and I think that's part of why we're talking about reading the Sermon on the Mount. If you can read it every day, even better. I just said do it once, but you know, if you read it every day, what are you going to go to work thinking about? You're certainly not going to go to work thinking about evil things. You're going to have all of this Sermon on the Mount in your mind. You're going to be thinking about good things. It's when we start thinking about or letting our mind drift into worldly things, or we get into some situation where we're not pure with our thoughts. That's where we end up with problems. John?
You know, every time I read this, this is not meant to be comical. It's a reality of how we do things. I'll use this as an example. Probably every adult here has went car shopping. You go to a car dealership, you look around. Then you go again, then you convince yourself that you need it, that you deserve it, that you want it, and eventually you buy that car. Because you've occupied it and you've convinced yourself of it, and eventually you don't. It's the same process. You start thinking on these things, I deserve this, the situation I'm in right now is horrible, I can escape that, God wouldn't want me to do this, and I deserve it, and then I'm done. So.
Tanya says the way I do that is I say I need it, right? We convince ourselves we need it. Well, that's kind of funny when we're talking about something, you know, I kind of want, and then I convince myself we need it, and then that's the justification for getting it. What's not funny is when I lust after, you know, the LSD, the lust leads to the sin, which leads to death, that James also talks about. When you start dwelling on these things we shouldn't be dwelling on, they're going to ultimately lead towards action, which causes us to sin against God. So our greatest joy, I just put down here, what do we want most in life? You know, because sometimes we do get wrapped up. We say, well, yes, we want to focus on God. I want to have a pure heart, but I'm busy. I'm at work, I'm doing this. So then how much of my time is truly having a pure heart and focusing on God? Even if it's not having a bad heart, but if I'm just, my focus is going away, what do we really want? Our focus, remember that it's that whole being, that is what the real meaning talks about. That whole being in me, is my whole being wanting to go to heaven? Is that what my longing and my desire is, to get to heaven? If it is, I'm probably going to have a pure heart, because I'm going to be focused on those things from God. Our greatest joy in life should be to see God. And we talked about that, I think, last week, talking about, you know, often we talk about longing for heaven. It's not heaven we want to go to. We only want to go to heaven because that's what God is. We want to see God face to face. If God wasn't there, then heaven's nothing, right? The heaven's great because that's what God is. Sarah?
Oh, no, sorry.
Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I know Chad was talking about this on Sunday, reading some of the passages just leading right up to this. So hopefully I'm not jumping on a lesson that I know he said he was working on getting together, but I really love these verses. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It's easy to read, but it's pretty hard when you actually think about what it's saying there. And are we running towards God? Are we really, is this race, do we realize it's a race? And our finish line needs to be with God, and that's where we should be longing for, to finish that race faithfully. Anybody have any questions on pure in heart?
I'll throw out a name, Soren Kierkegaard, which means nothing to me. He's a Norwegian philosopher. I had a catchphrase that purity of heart is to will one thing.
Will what?
To will one thing. In Hebrews chapter 1, or 12 verse 2, he tells us to look to Jesus, you know, as the example of all of his interactions, all of his work, all of his talk and travel, all that he did from rising to laying down, worked towards a single purpose. And the same thing ought to be for us. You know, that's not all going to play out in the exact same way. There are people who use their opportunities at work to teach other people or to earn money to then help fund the spread of the gospel. But how many times are we double-willed, triple-willed people where we will so many things that our will is divided of what we would like to do? And I just think his little catchphrase is a pretty powerful.
That's a good point. Jesus did only the will of the Father. Singular purpose, singular mission, singular goal throughout his entire time on earth. Singular all the way through. Blessed is the pure, are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I hope we all long to be able to see God. Next one here, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. So peacemakers, that's the Greek word there for, it's only used at one time, obviously because it's connected, peace, and then makers, but it means to be peaceable, loving peace. Kind of they go at the angle of this from the opposite side. Peacemakers do not create strife, they do not hate, do not fight, do not cause divisions, do not cause disputes. Peacemakers are concerned about reconciliation, and I think that really gets to the heart of what you're trying to do. Are you just trying to make peace, like, hey, there's people fighting, let's go ahead and get in the middle and try to help out with some, like, are we like some negotiator where we go in and try to make peace? That's not really what we're talking about here. It's that really it's to reconcile. Ultimately, are we at peace with God? So we have to have that first. First and foremost, I need to make sure that I'm at peace with God. And have that reconciliation with God. And then once I have that, once I have been made right because of the blood of Christ, once I've had peace with God, now I need to help you. That's making peace, right? Now I need to be a peacemaker. I'm going to try to make peace, help you to be at peace or reconciled to God. And that's just going to naturally happen, right? If I'm at peace with God, I want you to be at peace with God as well. So if I see you two fighting here, I'm going to come in between because I want you to be at peace, certainly with God. And to do that, you can't say you love God who you haven't seen, or you can't say you hate your brother and then say you love God, right? How can you do that? John talks about that, right? So we can't, well, I really love God, but John, man, that rotten guy, I don't care for John. Well, something's wrong there, right? So talking about peacemakers, it's really concerning itself, that focus on reconciliation with God. Yeah.
The term peacemaker and how we often use it is, or how it's thought of as, like you said, there's two warring sides, and an external influence would come in and try to make peace between the two. Sometimes the peacemaker is involved in the conflict, and certainly for the application of what this is talking about, and I think it's what you're implying, the ultimate conflict is the conflict between Satan and God. We're peacemakers in that. We are in the middle of that. And through the gospel, we bring peace to those who were influenced by Satan to God. But like you said, we had to have that peace first.
Well, that's right, because if I just made peace, if you guys were fighting with you guys over here, and we made peace and we just agreed to disagree or whatever, are we at peace with God? Ultimately, we need to be at peace with God. To agree to disagree, to make friends with those that are teaching false doctrine or something, but we're going to be at peace. We're doing really good because I'm supposed to be a peacemaker. I'm going to be at peace with these people. That wouldn't truly be a peacemaker, would it? We're going to allow somebody to not be reconciled with God so that we can say that we have unity. Well, we don't have unity, right? Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, and this gets into talking about unity. And so you can't just agree to be divided and then still claim that you have unity. I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to have a walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's one body, there's one Spirit, just as you were called, one hope, one of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God God and Father of all, who is above all, through all, and in you all. So if I don't believe that, I say there's a number of faiths, or there's a number of baptisms, but we're going to use this passage to say we should have peace and be in unity. We can't just do that. We have to have reconciliation with God. We have to be right with God ourselves, and then we want to help others to be right with God as well. Any thoughts on that? James, we've got James 4. That was interesting. Also James 4, 1 to 3. James 4, 1 through 3. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desire for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder, you covet, and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Chad, do you have anything?
Sometimes we look at the concept of peacemakers as being peaceful, but it's an active process. Where Jesus was the high priest who mediated between us and God. As Ephesians chapter 2 mentions, that he broke down that dividing wall of hostility and thus made peace between us and God. We, as Christians, are priests, as we talked about on Sunday. And our job and our role is to bring people to God to make peace between them. Whether it's by prayers of intercessions, teaching them the gospel, making disciples, that peacemaking process. I think that's a large part of it as well.
Well, and to be peacemakers, we're not going to be selfish, and I think that's what that James is looking at. If we're selfish, if I'm selfish, I'm not really concerned about peace, right? I'm not really concerned about you when I'm selfish, and that's what we saw, I think, through a lot of these, right? It's all about me. None of these things are really going to work towards me, because this involves being selfless, and it involves all these beatitudes involve not being arrogant, not being proud. Certainly when I'm selfish, I don't really care to make peace. I just care about myself. So living that last beatitude, that pure in heart, that'll help us to be peacemakers, right? If I'm literally looking to have a purity of heart, a desire to serve God, a desire to make peace with God, a desire to be reconciled with God, and a desire that you're reconciled with God too. You mix that all up, and what you're going to have is somebody that really cares about others, and we're really going to strive to make peace. Romans 12. Josh, you want to read that one? Romans 12, 17 to 21.
What verses?
Verse 17 to 21.
Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Goes back to selfishness, right? I'm trying to avenge myself. Am I trying to avenge myself? Here Paul says, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Have you ever heard people say vengeance is mine, I will repay? You just don't say where that came from. You hear that used, just that portion of the phrase, but I remember we were at FC camp, and we attacked another cabin, and they came at the breakfast and they said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And then we got up and said, well, we know who the Lord is, but who are you? You know, so we challenged them back again a second time there because they misused scripture. But, you know, vengeance is the Lord's and he will repay. But if I'm selfish, I'm going to want to repay that. If I'm not a peacemaker, I don't want to wait for the Lord, right? I'm gonna make it right myself. If that's the attitude that I have, and that's obviously not the attitude that we're supposed to have. If your enemy hungers, feed them. If he thirsts, give him a drink. That's not what we naturally, you know, tend to want to do. But that's what a peacemaker does. That's somebody that wants to serve God, have that person, even your enemy, reconciled to God. And then in James 3:16 and 17, James 3:16 and 17, for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing will be there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure. We just talked about pure in heart, right? Is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good works, without partiality and without hypocrisy. I mean, there you go. That just describes it right there. That's the way we ought to be. That's how we should be living. Obviously, God's that ultimate peacemaker. He wants us to make peace with others as well. When we get to the questions here, number 8 there on C, what traits are essential in a peacemaker?
I think it goes back to the need for your purity of heart and your spirit. It's building with one, so.
It is, isn't it? It is. And we've seen that all the way through. You know, once you start, I'm not saying it has to go that way, but we certainly have to. If somebody looks at you and doesn't see these attributes or these character traits in you, are you in God's kingdom? Are you a child of God? We might want to wonder about that, right?
Where in the world would purity of heart, loneliness of spirit be considered good characteristic traits? Nowhere.
Nowhere but in God's kingdom, right? Yep.
Were you going to do part B?
What's that?
We can do part B.
Part B? I was going to just jump back to part B. Go for it on part B.
I thought it was an interesting question.
Okay, well, the question is, would this beatitude have been surprising to those disciples who expected a worldly kingdom ushered in by a conquering Messiah? Which is what they were thinking, right? They were thinking this is going to be just like David. When David came in, he conquered everything, and we had this great kingdom. John?
I was just going along with what you were talking about with vengeance is mine, what Josh read. The Lord will repay, but he wasn't going to repay at this time. But I think maybe the thought of these people that the king was going to come and take revenge upon his enemies. You consider what they've been through, what they were going through. Just kind of the thought I had with that. A king's going to come, and we're going to deal with our enemies.
That's right. So the Messiah's here. Okay, so you're the Messiah. When do we start our military training so we can whoop all these Romans, right? I mean, that's, honestly, I think that would have been the natural thought. If I would have lived then, I would have thought, yes, the Messiah's finally here. When do we go to battle against and get rid of all these Romans that have taken over? When are we going to take over? When's the battle start? When does the war start? And Jesus is talking about peacemakers. Wait a minute, that's not what I expected to hear.
It's like with David, whenever he had went to Bathsheba, the story of Uriah, and it says at the beginning that it was a time when kings went out to war. David didn't go to war. But it was an understood thing that king leads his men to war. We have a king coming on Messiah. We're going to take revenge on him.
Yeah, we're going to war because we're going to get this kingdom back. Well, and then part D on this, what kind of peace should these peacemakers spread?
Peace of God.
Yeah, Ephesians 2, verses 13 to 17. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once afar off have been made near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of division between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, that he himself might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death enmity. And he came and preached peace to those who are far off, to those who were near. Peace. Not what they were expecting, I don't think, when they were waiting for the Messiah to come. But that's what Jesus was bringing. Blessed are the peacemakers, their reward, you'll be called Son of God. What an incredible blessing to have the favor of God. So the last one we'll look at here is blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. It's interesting, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Isn't that where we started? Verse 1. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. On that interesting, it starts out and it ends. Or hopefully it will end for every one of us, that if we are persecuted, and in some ways we should and better be persecuted, if we're living correctly for the Lord, we will be persecuted, but that would seem like that doesn't work too good. I thought it was going to be in the kingdom. Yeah, you'll be in the kingdom. You'll be in the kingdom. You'll be there right alongside all the others, all the prophets, right? All the prophets that were persecuted. All the apostles here will soon go through this persecution physically. Most all of them of being killed for the cause of Christ. We remember in the book of Revelation where the prayers of those who have been martyred are coming up. And how long, O Lord? They're in the kingdom of heaven. And we will be too. We suffer through that persecution. So starting out and ending the same way. If we start out with that poor in spirit, and we end up being faithful all the way through life from that time forward. And if that persecution brings our death, if that persecution just gives us a hard time through life, it doesn't matter because we've got the reward at the end. That's the Strong's word there. I forgot, it was used a whole lot of times, I can't remember. But I want to say it was a whole lot, so there were so many different words that are close to that. I didn't put them all down. Persecuted means to make to run or flee, to put to flight, drive away, to pursue, to harass, trouble, molest, mistreat, suffer persecution. It's not just being persecuted, because I could be persecuted for anything, right? We're not supposed to just take hits all the time, I'm being persecuted. No, for righteousness' sake. That's the point that we're looking at here, for our faith in Jesus Christ. 1 Peter, Josh, you mind getting that? 1 Peter 4, 15 and 16. First Peter 4, verses 15 and 16.
But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name.
Isn't that something? We're supposed to glorify God when we're persecuted. Now, if we're persecuted for all these other things because I did something wrong and I'm being persecuted, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about those that would be persecuted or suffer as a Christian. Let them not be ashamed, but let them glorify. And we see the apostles glorifying God, getting beaten, pulled in, beat up, thrown into prison. And what are they doing? Glorifying God? Singing? What? How do you sing after you've just been beaten and thrown in prison in the middle of the night? Yeah, that's what they did. Because they were happy to be able to suffer shame for his name. They were able to glorify God in that manner. Chad, you want to get 1 Timothy 3, 12 and 13? First Timothy 3, verses 12 and 13. Huh. That might not be the right one.
I was thinking, I think you're thinking of 2 Timothy 3. 12 and 13. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted.
That works a little bit. That would be correct.
Well, well, people and imposters will go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived.
Yep. Yes.
Like even chapter 2 with that also read verse 12. I don't know if you have it written down or not.
I did not. But you wanna read that, John?
If we endure, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us.
Well, that's pretty scary, isn't it? That was in, what verse was that, John?
Verse 12, I believe, in chapter 2 is.
Okay. So it should be expected. I think the point here is, if we're not suffering at all, maybe we need to reevaluate what's going on, right? I mean, if my life is so easy, and it is very easy, we've got limited, we can call it persecution right now, the fact that there's folks in Canada that are shut down, they're not able to worship, or I think they've got back to 30% or something now, where they can meet, but for a long time they haven't been able to worship. If you would have told me that a year and a half ago, we would have laughed and said, no way, that's not gonna happen. It would never happen. We have freedom of religion, these things aren't gonna happen. And then what happens? That's exactly what, we've got this light affliction, I would call it, right? This light persecution. We didn't think we were gonna have these things happening to us. What's gonna happen very shortly? I don't know. We may very well truly get persecuted in a physical way in the future. Are we going to be faithful to God? I certainly hope so. And if I'm going along and everything's just easy throughout my entire life and I never suffer anything for the cause of Christ, I wonder if I'm really standing up like I ought to for the Lord. Maybe I'm not. Maybe do I just back away from every conversation when things go when people are making fun of God, when people are cursing God, when people are blaspheming God's name? Do I just walk away and not even say a word? Well, if I do, I'm certainly not suffering any persecution, not for Christ. And I'm certainly then, what's going to happen? I'm not going to be in the kingdom of heaven. So I think we really need to be careful and make sure our life is so easy here in this country and so many others have it so difficult. And we need to be careful that even a light persecution doesn't cause us to lose our faith. Matthew 13:20 and 21. But he who receives the seed on the stony place is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation and persecution arises because of the word, immediately it stumbles. Is that me? Is that me? I hope not. A little bit of persecution comes our way and I'm out. That's not what I was looking for. And we've seen people, unfortunately, I think you may have all seen people like this over the course of your life. I taught a friend of mine, he was on fire for the Lord, he was really faithful for a little while, and then just cares of the world got a hold of him, and all of a sudden he drifted away. That shouldn't be us. We should be able to endure the persecution. I mentioned about the apostles, Acts 5 here, verse 40 and 41. Acts 5. and 41. And they agreed with him, and when they had called for the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. So they went to their home and hid, never did a thing again. Hid in their basement, and just were happy they got out of there with their lives. That's not exactly what they did. So when they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name, and daily in the temple, what? You just got beaten for doing this. Very next day, they go back and they continue to preach and teach Jesus. That's not what our inclination would be. Even now, when there's a light pressure or whatever we call this, where there's pressure to not worship God, what do? They got beat up, showed up the next day, doing the exact same thing they were told not to do. I don't know, would we have the strength and courage to do that? For great is your reward in heaven, certainly, if you're willing to suffer that persecution. And if you are, you're called blessed. And if you're doing it for righteousness' sake, then you're gonna have a home in heaven. You're gonna see God. Were there some other questions that went along with persecuted? We have a few more minutes here. I had number 9C. What is said about this type of suffering? Because this is what we just read in Acts 5:41. And then Philippians 1:28 and 29.
Calls for rejoicing to be counted worthy.
Rejoicing, because I was counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And then Philippians 1:28 and 29. Not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God. For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. To suffer for his sake. Not to let this terrify us. Oh, I'm sorry.
So I wanted to just add a thought when we were on Matthew 13.
Yep.
Where it says, hold on, let me find my square again. Oh, I thought I lost it. It says persecution and tribulation,
Yes, tribulation or persecution.
which I think is broader than just persecution, that means any type of problem that's happening. And we currently have a problem happening. And there has been persecution this year.
Yeah.
And last year, where people think it's not right that we're in services, it's not right that we're close together and things like that. And churches have actually, members have actually stood up and fought against that, even fought against the government in like California and even in this state, and did what was right. But there was tribulation and persecution. I don't remember my whole point, but I think that's another area that by us standing up during this time and doing what God tells us to do, there is tribulation and there is persecution, and the tribulation comes from the risks that are involved. But those risks are worth it, as the scripture you had just read about Christ. I can't remember it now. But doing it for suffering for Christ.
Yes.
For Christ's sake. That would be suffering for Christ's sake, and it makes worth dying. It's worth dying for, no matter what it is.
Yeah.
To do what he says.
Well, there's some things that you learn. Remember when you look at Hebrews, where it talks about being a babe and you just handle the milk, the word. Then when you get stronger, you learn more, and you grow up a little bit. Now you can handle some meat, but you don't throw a baby meat. You have to work your way into that so that they can handle it. I don't want to talk about it, but persecution is like that too, right? If I can't handle just a light tribulation that comes my way, and I'm going to fade back in woodwork when we're taking God's name in vain and laughing and joking and doing things that are blaspheming God, but I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to highlight myself. Something as simple as that little tribulation there. But if I do stand through the little tribulation, when persecution comes, I'm going to be in a better position to suffer for the cause of Christ. I'll be able to handle some persecution. Maybe when that light persecution comes, now when like Josh gets drug out for worshiping God, am I going to give up? Quit? Like, I mean, when it gets really bad, I think it comes, if I just can't handle the light affliction that comes upon us for a time, if I can't handle the light affliction, what happens when the real bad stuff comes? Now, I hope that never happens, but I wouldn't have thought we'd be where we are today either. So, we've got to be able to be strong through the light affliction, these light tribulation, this light persecution, if I'm ever going to be able to get drugged into prison like they were, and then come out and glorify God, be glad that I was counted worthy to suffer shame for his name, and get up the next morning and go right back to the temple. This is where they were told not to go. You are not allowed to come back here, and you're not allowed to talk about Jesus. And the next morning I show up and I talk about Jesus at the very place you told me not to. And they were excited about that.
Just everything you were just describing makes me think of James 1:2-4, talking about having all joy when you meet trials, and then it produces steadfastness.
Yes.
So it makes it easier to endure by the trials that you go through in the first place. Each time it's easier to lean on God and to endure
Yes.
through it.
Yes. So, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. The reward is for those who have Chad.
Eat of all your time, sorry.
No.
Of all the Beatitudes, he mentions this one twice, and he does something unique between verse 10 and verse 11, where he takes it out of the theoretical realm of blessed are those to blessed are you in verse 11. I found that to be interesting. Of all the ones that repeat, he repeats this. You're talking to people, and one of the first 7 things that you're going to say to people about following you, being Jesus, is persecution. He's rather upfront about that. I read a book recently, and I want to share just a couple paragraphs if you don't mind. It's dealing with this topic of persecution. And the guy says a couple years ago.
Hold on one second.
Absolutely, sorry.
Chad, you can't do this because I didn't go over these last 2 verses because I was going to do that for the invitation. No, go ahead.
The guy says a couple years ago I was in China, and I visited an underground church gathering where I asked them about persecution. And each person who stood up and started sharing stories about persecution he or she endured, sometimes they had hidden themselves in walls because the government officials were coming. Others said they had run from gunshots. But I wish you could hear the way they were sharing it. Not everyone, or everyone was just laughing like it was a party. It sounded completely insane to me hearing them laugh about being shot at, but it didn't faze them because they expected it. And in their prayers, they were asking for God to take them to the most dangerous places, saying, I want to suffer for you. I don't want to go to a safe place. I don't, please. I want to be counted worthy to die for your name. So this is the way that they pray. If you had a group like this, how are you going to stop them? This is the way the church ought to be, an unstoppable force, ready to take a hit, and then go back into battle. And he goes on further to say that he talked to some of the leaders of the congregation there, and said that before they allowed people, try to get my phrasing right, before people became a Christian, they made a commitment to suffer. In the same way that Jesus asked his disciples to make a commitment to suffer. You don't get through a lengthy sermon of Jesus without that being a part of it. And it does kind of hit home that suffering is not a topic that's discussed amongst many churches. It is something that is viewed as foreign to Christians today. But Paul tells Timothy that everybody who desires to live a godly life will do it.
I was going to mention, I just had a couple of comments for the invitation tonight, but one of them I was going to talk about in looking at some of the commentaries on this. They mentioned, and I should have got the names of the 2 men, but 2 men that had been brought to the stake, and they were going to be burned because they refused to deny Christ, and they came rejoicing. And some said that the one that was even kind of skipping along, and he was, not that he was like out of his mind, he was totally in his mind. He was totally going to that and realizing that he was going to suffer. Ultimately, he was going to be burned alive and killed, but he was going home. And he mentioned, I think the sheriff said, why are you you look like you're excited to come in here to the state. He's like, well, because I'm going home. I'm going to my home. And I don't know, that would be really hard for us to, I can't imagine that. I just can't imagine it. We've had life so easy, I think, here in America, and we just don't seem to have to suffer even in the tribulation. We could barely have any tribulation, let alone persecution, that I have to stand up for and really wonder whether I'm gonna be killed for the cause of Christ or not. So that was a little bit that I was going to talk about. We've gone a little bit over here. Does anybody have any other comments or questions? So that finishes up the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and next week we will get into Matthew 5. We'll go through from 17 to 20. which is talking about Jesus fulfilling, which he fulfills the law. We'll look at some of those next week.
You said Lee, you're gonna talk about salt and light, Peter?
Yeah, I noticed that was, we can definitely, if you have some comments or questions about that,
I can
we
have
should.
I have a lot of thoughts about that, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I think it's two of the most wonderful thoughts you can have is salt and light and what that actually means. I love, especially salt maybe, I love the thought of that.
Well, we'll start with that next week before we get into the next lesson.
Everyone go home and put too much salt on your food and see if you like it. And understand what salt is not intended to do. It doesn't pay attention to itself.
All right, we'll break for a couple minutes here, and we'll kids back over here, and then we will have